The story of the Chernobyl radioactive meat train is one of the most unsettling narratives to emerge from the catastrophic Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986. When reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Pripyat, Ukraine, exploded on April 26th, it released an immense amount of radioactive particles into the atmosphere. These particles spread across Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and even reached parts of Western Europe, blanketing vast areas with dangerous radiation. The fallout's reach was so extensive that it contaminated not just the soil, water, and air, but also affected crops, livestock, and ecosystems. In the wake of this nuclear crisis, Soviet authorities faced an unprecedented challenge: how to manage, contain, and dispose of radioactive contamination on an immense scale. Among the most peculiar containment measures taken was the alleged existence of meat trains. Trains carrying radioactive meat that needed to be disposed of or isolated. As radioactive fallout settled over farmlands and pastures, livestock grazing in these contaminated zones absorbed radiation through their food and water sources. Cows, pigs, and other animals in affected areas became irradiated, turning their meat into dangerous, potentially lethal food sources. Yet the Soviet Union, already stretched thin by the financial demands of containing the Chernobyl disaster, faced difficult decisions about what to do with these contaminated animals. Official policy dictated that contaminated food sources had to be prevented from entering the food supply, but disposal posed its own logistical and ethical challenges. Reports of radioactive meat being transported across the Soviet Union by train have fueled speculation and concern, with some stories alleging that these trains had far darker purposes than disposal alone. The Chernobyl Meat Train has since become a symbol of the secrecy, desperation, and complexity that defined the Soviet response to the nuclear disaster. The nature of these meat trains and their purpose is a topic clouded by rumors, varying accounts, and conflicting reports. Some suggest that the meat trains were merely an attempt to dispose of contaminated meat by transporting it to remote areas for safe burial or incineration. This theory holds that Soviet authorities, facing contamination on a scale never before seen, needed a controlled way to handle the irradiated animals without allowing their remains to endanger people or wildlife. Incineration would have eliminated the risk of radioactive particles spreading further, while burial in designated exclusion zones could contain the spread within a limited area. However, managing the containment of radioactive meat was not straightforward. Given the long half-life of radioactive isotopes like cesium-137, approximately 30 years, any disposal method needed to consider long-term environmental and health impacts, making the burial or burning of contaminated meat a complex and potentially dangerous task. Another interpretation of the Chernobyl meat trains is that they served as a temporary storage solution for radioactive meat, while authorities sought a more permanent disposal method. Moving the meat away from populated areas was essential to limit public exposure to radiation. In this scenario, the trains would have served as a controlled containment method, allowing for time to assess the level of contamination and potential decontamination techniques that could reduce radiation levels. However, the logistics and storage conditions required to keep contaminated meat isolated for an extended period raise further questions. How long could radioactive meat realistically be stored before it posed additional risks? And with Soviet resources stretched thin in the aftermath of Chernobyl, it's uncertain whether such a prolonged storage solution would have been practical or effective. Perhaps the most disturbing theory surrounding the Chernobyl meat train is that contaminated meat was quietly redistributed across the Soviet Union, entering the food supply. According to some accounts, authorities, under pressure to reduce waste and avoid a food crisis, chose to blend contaminated meat with uncontaminated meat at processing facilities, allowing radioactive meat to be covertly circulated among citizens. While there is no concrete evidence to fully support this theory, the mere possibility is deeply unsettling. Considering the severe health risks posed by consuming radioactive isotopes like cesium-137 and strontium-90, the notion of contaminated meat entering the food chain would have disastrous implications. These isotopes, once ingested, can accumulate in human tissues, increasing the risk of thyroid cancer, bone marrow disorders, leukemia, and other radiation-related illnesses. The long-term health consequences would be significant, with an increased likelihood of cancer among those exposed, especially children, who are more vulnerable to radiation's effects. Beyond health concerns, the psychological impact of the Chernobyl Meat Train story reflects the broader climate of fear, distrust, and secrecy that permeated Soviet society in the aftermath of the disaster. Citizens who lived through Chernobyl's fallout were already subject to confusing, often contradictory information. Many were evacuated without knowing the extent of the danger or whether they would ever be able to return home. They were left in the dark about the health risks they faced, both immediately and long-term. In this context, rumors about radioactive meat in the food supply fed into a general sense of betrayal and mistrust, with citizens unsure of what or whom they could trust. The Soviet Union's handling of the disaster, marked by misinformation and censorship, created fertile ground for fear and speculation to take root. The legend of the radioactive meat train also exemplifies the extraordinary and often desperate measures taken by the Soviet government to contain the fallout from Chernobyl. In the early days after the explosion, there were immense efforts to construct the sarcophagus, a massive concrete structure intended to contain reactor number 4 and to evacuate tens of thousands of residents from surrounding areas. Soldiers, firefighters, and volunteers, known as liquidators, risked their lives to clean up radioactive debris, often with inadequate protective equipment. They buried contaminated soil, removed topsoil, and erected radiation shields to slow the spread of radioactive particles. In this chaotic environment, the meat train is emblematic of the broader struggle to manage contamination. If these trains were real, they reveal just how deeply the disaster permeated everyday life, affecting food, water, and the very fabric of society in ways that were unprecedented. While the most sensational versions of the Chernobyl Meat Train story remain unverified, the narrative has nonetheless persisted as part of Chernobyl's dark legacy. It serves as a reminder of the ethical and practical dilemmas that arise in the wake of a nuclear disaster. Today, strict international protocols exist for handling radioactive contamination in food, soil, and livestock. There are rigorous testing and containment procedures for contaminated meat to prevent it from entering the food supply, as well as standardized methods for the disposal of radioactive agricultural products. These protocols, born from experiences like Chernobyl, underscore the need for transparency, public safety, and international cooperation in the face of nuclear crises. For those who survived Chernobyl's initial disaster and those who lived in its aftermath, the story of the radioactive meat train remains a potent symbol of the unseen dangers that radiation poses. Unlike visible contaminants, radiation is odorless, tasteless, and invisible, making it especially insidious. People can be exposed to it without knowing until symptoms appear, often years or even decades later. This slow burn aspect of radiation exposure adds an eerie layer to the Chernobyl meat train narrative, hinting at the long-lasting consequences of a momentary disaster. Survivors and residents of the exclusion zone carry with them the psychological toll of living with radiation's invisible threat, the knowledge that the land, air, and even food could betray them at any moment. The Chernobyl disaster's impact extends well beyond the physical borders of Ukraine, and its legacy persists in the collective consciousness. Stories like the Chernobyl meat train may never be fully substantiated, yet they serve as powerful allegories of mistrust, secrecy, and survival in the shadow of nuclear catastrophe. As a potent piece of Cold War lore, the radioactive meat train forces us to confront the grim reality of nuclear accidents and the often inadequate human response to such crises. In the absence of transparency, these stories take on a life of their own, becoming cautionary tales that urge us to think critically about power, responsibility, and the invisible dangers that accompany technological advancement. Ultimately, the Chernobyl meat train remains a haunting metaphor for the challenges and ethical considerations that arose from the Chernobyl disaster. Whether rooted in fact, myth, or a combination of both, the story resonates because it reflects our fear of what cannot be controlled and what remains hidden. The idea that something as basic as food could become a vector of deadly contamination speaks to the broader, unsettling reality of living in a nuclear age. It's a reminder that disasters like Chernobyl reverberate through time, affecting not only those present in the moment, but also future generations, shaping our understanding of safety, transparency, and the enduring power of a story that warns us never to underestimate the invisible dangers that lurk in our world.